Last Friday, the position of John Lohr came up. He said, you know what, we should at least have the conversation about fracking, have government revisit. In fact, he said, if I'm elected, I will reverse the decision from 2014 that bans fracking in Nova Scotia. The NDP, in a news release, said, we need the Premier to, reaffirm the position that we are against fracking in Nova Scotia. So some are saying it was never proclaimed. It's not really law. It's not really true. So if there's not really a ban, then why are we talking about allowing it to take place? Why not get Andrew Younger in the studio to talk about it? And that's what we're going to do right now. And if you have a question, if you have a comment and you want to weigh in, have at it, because this is a chance for us to get to the bottom, perhaps, of this debate, or at least keep the conversation going. Andrew Younger, welcome back.
Happy to be here.
The issue of fracking, hydraulic fracturing, and I guess in some ways, I'm trying to point out that we're using gas at the power plant in order to create electricity, that there is gas being burned, and that the two projects that we know have been online are starting to wrap up. So does that mean that Nova Scotia Power and Emera will stop burning gas at Tufts Cove?
No, and it's bigger than that. We just finished converting many of our hospitals to gas. There are a lot of businesses and residents in Nova Scotia that use gas. So we are going to be using gas in the next year, 2 years, maybe within the next year, we will be importing gas. We will be using fracked gas in Nova Scotia. So we got to start there. And that, from an environmental point of view, is not necessarily bad because, of course, somewhere like Dalhousie was using heavy oil. So they've switched to natural gas from heavy oil, which was an environmental savings.
So they were like the Bunker C they were using?
Yeah, basically. And honestly, that's over at Tufts Cove. They're essentially using either Bunker C or natural gas, and sometimes they sell the gas too. And they say you can tell by the color of the smoke coming out of the stacks. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but that's
Andrew Younger's here with us. Is it true that there is not really a ban on hydraulic fracturing in Nova Scotia?
Well, there isn't a legal ban. The bill that I introduced back in 2014 has never been proclaimed. And I went on last night on the website just to double check, and it's still not proclaimed. So that piece of legislation is not law in Nova Scotia. So we need to get our heads around that first. The second thing is, I'm not convinced the government, through the Premier's office, really understands the current policies in the province. And I say that because if you go online again, you'll see there's a ministerial letter, or a letter to Minister Ian Rankin, who is the Minister of Environment, asking him to uphold the fracking ban. Well, it's not the responsibility of the Department of Environment. It's actually completely within the realm of the Department of Energy. So, they have a policy ban. One of the reasons we were told we had to bring legislation in 2014 was because we were told if the policy ban was ever challenged in court because someone came and made an application, it probably wouldn't hold up.
So if, in fact, that might still be the case, is that what we...
Well, I think if you were to call, if you're, your Sheldon McLeod drilling company, you call and you say, I'd like to frack a well, they'll say, yeah, I don't think you can. Then you ask for a ministerial review of your application and you may very well get approved. It's a legal gray area at the moment. What is important is the ban that the Premier and Jeff McClellan and others have said recently that they don't plan on overturning has never been proclaimed.
Okay.
So it's not law.
It's not law. Andrew Younger's in our studio, and we're talking a bit about, and it's optics, and it's about perhaps attitude, perhaps it's about leadership, perhaps it's any of those things, or a combination of all, when it comes to saying we don't want it because Nova Scotians don't want it. But what I'm seeing from the opposition, from the guy who wants to be the next leader of the opposition, he's saying communities should be allowed to decide whether or not. Should there be at least that discussion?
Yeah, absolutely there should. So and this is the thing, I don't tend to be a black and white person on these issues, but one of the reasons behind the bill, people either loved or hated that bill in 2014, but if people had listened to the press conference at the time and really paid attention to the content, the idea was we would do an atlas, a proper atlas, to say what areas are we talking about with gas. Well, that's finally been released. Not quite what I had promised, but close enough. It's something. Then we can have the discussion in those communities about whether they're interested. So there is no community at the moment who has said they're interested in having it. In fact, UNSM has a motion, an official motion, or did, as far as I know, it's not rescinded, saying that no municipality would be in favor of it. The bigger issue that we face in terms of these issues is Indigenous consent. And I met with Indigenous leaders at the time, and there was no appetite to have that. Now, what the government was supposed to do since 2014 is to have those discussions. Now, not necessarily with the aim of allowing fracking, but have the discussions with Indigenous leaders and municipalities and communities without the worry that somebody was coming in with a project. And those discussions haven't happened. Nothing's going to happen if anything's ever going to happen, nothing's going to happen without those discussions because they're legal impediments.
We've got Andrew Younger in our studio, and he spent some time in government. In fact, was there when the 2014 announcement was made that there was going to be a policy decision not to perhaps allow fracking here in Nova Scotia. When it comes to hydraulic fracturing, people point to studies. They point to, we're worried about our groundwater. We're worried about earthquakes. Just about, it's like many arguments these days. If you look hard enough, you can find some fact to back up your position. So what was the briefing like for you? And I don't know if that violates any kind of confidentiality, but what were you told about the real and imminent danger that could arise from fracking gas?
Here's what so there are dangers like there are with anything. There are places in the world and locations where this has been done safely and well without any issues, and there's places where there have been absolute disasters with it. The biggest challenge is it's better when the chemicals are disclosed, so you know it's tested for. So I mean that should be a non-starter. That if any kind of drilling activity was going to be allowed, you'd do that. But I think that one of the things that I really learned from it in talking to a number of geologists and so forth is there wasn't a lot of industry interest in this in Nova Scotia. There have been something like 188, maybe a few more or less wells drilled in Nova Scotia. None have come up with commercial quantities of gas oil. Some of those have been fracked in Nova Scotia. And there were a few reasons that this was important. One, the only real commercial success, and this is only an early commercial success with onshore oil or gas in Nova Scotia, is the coal bed methane up in Pictou County, which is underway at the moment.
And that's been
and that's not fracked.
But that's part of the Ford seam. There's been an issue with methane for years.
Well, yeah, anybody that knows Westray knows.
Look back to Westray.
Yeah,
exactly.
and what was interesting about that is the wells, the drinking water wells, were tested of people in the area before drilling began. And there was already methane in the drinking water wells, and people were surprised, right? But there is a lot of polarized debate both in favor and against fracking, and that's problematic. So you look at a movie like Gasland, and then you look at the movie, the name I can't remember, but came out in response to Gasland. Neither one of those is terribly helpful because they both torque the facts to an extreme.
Well, that's part of what a documentary is trying to align with the director.
That's what that sort of documentary is. Yes. But the problem here is that we are using all of a sudden this atlas comes out and we're having a lot of oxygen burned up talking about whether we should allow fracking in Nova Scotia when the odds of companies racing to come in is very low because fracking was allowed here. In fact, fracking happened here and there wasn't a lot of activity going on. And the reason there wasn't was because there were more obvious places to do it. So why would you as a company with the very low natural gas prices at the moment spend all kinds of money exploring in Nova Scotia when you already have the Marcellus shales and you have known gas fields where you can work much more cost effectively in the current regime? The other problem for Nova Scotia, and you talk about the briefing I had, was that there was going to be a necessity for the province to spend millions of dollars to set up a regulatory mechanism to govern onshore drilling if you were going to have it in any magnitude. And that had to come before you even knew if there were gas or jobs or anything available. And that money has to come from somewhere. So it was a question also of what the government priorities were. From an oil and gas perspective, our priorities were the offshore.
We've got in our studio Andrew Younger, and we're talking about hydraulic fracturing. There's a story in the Herald, I don't know if you caught this, but David Wheeler, who was involved with the fracking report in 2014, said, you know what, I stand beside every single word of that report from almost 4 years ago now. Part of what he was suggesting was more research, more perhaps exploration into whether this, and at the time I remember having the conversation, we don't know if there's a lot of gas, if there's some gas, if there's much, and as you point out, if there was a market, if there was a real economic opportunity, big business would already be knocking at our door.
Well, that's right. I mean, because you got to remember there was commercial work being done in New Brunswick. We were here in Nova Scotia, and people had looked, they hadn't found it. The problem with David Wheeler's report was we had panelists who were involved in writing that report. Some who came out and said that the legislation we passed was exactly in line with what the report was recommending, and some said it was completely opposed to what we were recommending. So even the panelists couldn't agree on what they were saying. But there was a couple things they pointed out that were important. Research is important. And it doesn't matter if you're in favor or against. The research is important because what this debate lacks is facts. Because so much of it is spin and so much of it is torqued and extreme sides. And the other thing is understanding what community consent means. At the moment, you do not have a community that wants it. I've talked to farmers who say, yeah, I would love to have a well in my back 40 and that would give me some extra income. But I've also talked to some people that own vineyards who say, we can't have wells nearby because of the volatile organic compounds impact our grapes, or they believe they impact the grapes. And the wine industry is big here. Is that real or not? I don't know, but they're worried about it. And the problem for their point of view is it's a marketing issue. Can they now market their blueberries, their grapes, their whatever? That's where you need real facts. The other thing, too, is I think, we're going to turn around in 10 years or 15 years. Fracking is going to be largely irrelevant because it's extremely expensive for business to do. So if they want to if there is commercially viable gas in Nova Scotia, if people want to get at it, we won't be talking about fracking because we're already past some of the technologies that were being used because they want to reduce water and so forth. So we'll be talking about getting gas out in other ways. And I know people are going to call in and email you and tweet and say, well, yes, but we got to stop using fossil fuels. There are a lot of other things natural gas is used for, not least of which is the creation of fertilizer, right. Which is going to become increasingly important as we have to increase plant food production.
Potash and all that other stuff. We're going to keep the conversation going. We've got Andrew Younger in our studio, and I have not asked him yet what his personal thoughts are on fracking. And again, part of my mind was if we're already burning gas and there is an opportunity, let's explore it. The other side of it is if it was a viable alternative, if it was a viable option for business, they'd be pounding down our door to get it. But then does all the gas go somewhere else and we don't get our own access to it? That already happened. We're going to talk a little more about fracking with Andrew right after this. All right, welcome back to the Sheldon McLeod Show here on News 95.7. We've got Andrew Younger in our studio, and it's not like we're telling secrets. We're talking about fracking, and we're talking about some of the policies that were taken, some of the points. We're trying to get some of the facts out into the general conversation. Barry joins us with something else he wants to talk about. Barry, you're on.
This is not related to fracking, but it is to energy, and I'm always interested in hearing Andrew's comments. And that is, I guess, we've for a long time had a ban on accessing uranium in Nova Scotia, and I'm just wondering, is that legislation similar to what we've created or not created on fracking? And also rare earth elements would be involved in that as well.
All right, Barry, thanks. We'll actually off air here.
Yeah, so that bill was proclaimed. That was passed by the NDP government. I think it was one of the early ones. It was championed by Graham Steele at the time. It bans uranium mining. The challenge with that bill, if you were in the mining business, is that the way it's worded makes it very difficult to go after rare earth elements, which are used in solar panels and wind turbines and telephones and stuff. There is talk that we have a lot of rare earth elements around. It's one of those things that, my own personal view, I didn't like the legislation at the time, but it is similar. I would tell you it's very similar in this respect. It's another one of those issues that communities need to have discussions about with facts and information, and there is a real gap in this province and elsewhere too, but really in this province, about having sane conversations about issues without the pressure of some development coming down. Like if we talk about high rises, we talk about it because someone's proposed a high rise. We talk about offshore, it's because somebody's drilling something offshore. We need to have these discussions without a potential project sitting right there. And uranium is just another example.
Andrew Younger's in our studio, and I got to ask, do you support fracking? Is that something that you can say one way or the other? You have enough evidence to support or perhaps condemn?
So See, I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other, and I know that sounds like sitting on the fence or trying to avoid answering. But here's my issue: I don't think it's really going to become an issue in Nova Scotia, because I don't think that in Nova Scotia there are companies that would spend the money to go after doing this. So I don't spend a lot of time getting all that worked up about it. I do think if we're going to do it, we need the community consent. We need to define what community consent is, and we need the Indigenous. We need to deal with the Indigenous issues. The other thing is the perfect example, fracking is this generic term that everybody has their own definition of. Wells are stimulated in a lot of ways. We frack drinking water wells in Nova Scotia, which is a little bit different, but we need to understand what it is we will and will not allow. And I think the discussion is worth having. And I think the most important part of it, I think we need to have the discussions.
But how do you have the discussion about something that is so polarizing? I'm thinking of the glyphosate issue that, people in this province, including Lenore Zan, said, we got to stop this policy. We got to stop this practice. We got to ban it outright. But yet blueberry producers say this is an important part of what they do to control weeds. And it's been used for years.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's harder when something's being used, right? Like, so the fracking debate in New Brunswick was much more complicated because they stopped something that was already being done. The problem is that government is not trusted, and it's not about Liberals or Tories or NDP.
Well, no, all governments are mistrusted.
Pretty much all governments are mistrusted, and so we need to come up with a way to talk about these controversial issues and define what is environmental protection, how we manage our resources. What we allow, what the real science is, put it all up and let people comment on it. It used to be that governments commissioned independent peer-reviewed science. They don't do that so much anymore. That's what's allowed the gaps to be filled by public relations. And listen, I've been in public relations and communication, so I get it. But the companies hire lobby firms. The Wheeler report, contributed to the debate, but those meetings turned into how many people can you get at the meeting to scream and yell. That isn't a discussion. We need to have a discussion about options without people feeling like there's an ulterior motive in that discussion. That's not easy.
Well, and speaking of that, I got included in a bunch of conversations over the weekend about school board amalgamation. I don't know if this has come up in your circle or not. A few people suggesting that Dr. Avis Glaze, who was hired by the province, that's been filed too, and the minister told me, or at least his spokesperson said, they are reviewing it. They're not yet commenting on it, and people are saying, it went right to the Department of Education, bypassing school boards, bypassing the administration part, and that many are really worried that this is going to be used as a basis to come up with a plan to get rid of school boards in this province.
Yeah, and there's some people that would say that's a good idea, and some people would say that's a bad idea, right?
But that, again, is a report, and is it based on fact? Is it based on opinion? Is it based on science? Well, it's Avis Glaze's opinion.
I think, and it is an opinion, every one of these reports is. So when we received Wheeler's fracking report, we released it on the day it was received. The final report was received. And I think government should do that with all these reports. It allows them the opportunity to not have to comment on it, because they say, we haven't read it yet. Here's the report. Yeah. And we want to hear your feedback now. What government is doing is, sure, the minister may be reading it, or he's at least reading the executive summary. And I don't mean that as an insult. It's just it's the way things happen sometimes. But
hell, I go looking for it. It just saves time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what's really happening is the communications department and the Department of Education's reading it to figure out what their messages are going to be. That's not a good way to deal with public policy. Release it. See what people have to say. And you know what? There are people out there that think school boards shouldn't exist, who believe that really, because you got to remember, every time there's a school closure, what's the minister do? Oh, sorry, it's not mine. That's the board. But the board doesn't have any taxation power. So I don't think they're going to get rid of the boards, because ministers tend to like the school boards. But
it's insulation. I've called it that before. School boards are political insulation.
And it's all it is, really, because school boards have very little power. I sit on a school advisory committee, and we provide more direct advice to the minister or as much as the board does.
I've done that. I've had that role, and I've seen it from the inside, and that's how I got involved, was through school review. Yeah. And that now twice, 2 governments later, it's changed. The policy changed.
But as soon as every one of these reports or any one of these issues becomes defined by the communications and marketing department, that's a problem. And that's where, I've been in that industry a long time. I ran a communications firm. It's got to change. Communications has to be about providing people open and transparent information instead of about providing talking points. And that's what this is all about. It's all about who's got the best talking point.
Well, in fact, the Premier did a bit of an apology over the holidays, saying in his year-end interviews that perhaps he was a little harsh to go after the Auditor General for criticizing his communication.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that argue he either didn't understand or didn't properly read what the Auditor General was saying, because the Auditor General wasn't as critical as it almost seemed like he read the news headlines as opposed to actually reading what the Auditor General was saying, because the Auditor General had some very wise and insightful insights, and he can choose to disagree with them, but they were the opinion of the Auditor General.
You may be entitled to your opinions, but not your own facts. I heard that quote over the weekend.
Yeah, although it doesn't seem to play true anymore.
Well, not on the internet.
Not on Facebook.
Not on Facebook. They have changed Facebook. I noticed I had a lot more notifications than
but the problem, everybody thinks they're right, and we're all guilty of it, but everybody believes their facts are right, and it's so hard for people to say, oh, there might be another opinion out there.
Like Nova Scotia Power is guaranteed a 9% profit?
Yes, things like that.
Things like that. All right. Always a pleasure to get you into the studio. Thank you for stopping in and sharing with us. And we're not really sure whether you support or are not.
I just think we're spending too much. And here we are. We just spent half an hour on it. But I mean, that's the problem, is that people are, I think, they're getting their knickers in a knot over something that probably is not going to be a reality in Nova Scotia.
And if glyphosate is something people don't agree with, it can be policy whether it's science or not, if they speak up and
absolutely
push government to
and a lot of this is around how you control it and the regulations and ensure. And when people see something like Northern Pulp, for example, they get fearful that the regulations are just not being followed. And that's what makes people scared. I think people would be in favor of a lot more development in Nova Scotia and elsewhere if they had faith that the protections and for the environment and everything else and people were actually being followed and enforced.
Andrew Younger. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.